What's going on, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Patriot Backtalk. I'm your host, Kyle Johnson. Today, we're going to break into the war in Ukraine. And this is going to include Russia's big picture plans, China's involvement with Russia, as well as their own ambitions, and how all of it is affecting us here in America. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I'm a world-class expert at foreign relations, okay? But I do my research. And as always, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys the facts and my take on what they mean, and then allow you to make your own opinion based off of that. So let's dig right in to the beginning of what has all occurred overseas in the last couple months. Now, as I said, I'm going to begin with the facts. And basically, I'm going to give you a timeline starting with the official declaration of war, which was February 24th, 2022. And I'm going to take you through the weeks that followed. But it's important to note that this occupation of Ukraine was actually on Putin's radar long before then. Putin has always wanted to reclaim the territory lost by the collapse of the Soviet Union, towards the end of the 1980s to early 1990s. Actually, Christmas Day 1991 was the last day that the Soviet flag flew over the Kremlin. And since then, they've lost territory and been shrunk down to the Russia we know today. But Putin was never willing to accept this, and has always had it in his mind to rebuild the glory of the Soviet Union. And the Russian people, by and large, agree with him. And we hear stories in the news recently of Russian people revolting against this war, but this is honestly not representing the overarching views of the people there. According to a recent poll taken in Russia that was reported by the Washington Post, which I would never trust by itself, but I found multiple other news sources confirming it. Almost 60% of the Russian population supports the invasion of Ukraine, while only about 20% said they didn't really agree with it. The rest basically didn't care one way or the other. So make no mistake, Putin and the Russian people are in this together. So, February 24th, 2022. After weeks and weeks of claiming, and I quote, "We are not going to impose anything on anyone by force," Putin officially declared war in Ukraine and began a full-scale invasion of the country almost immediately. Now, a lot happened in the first few days of this invasion. Russia moved quickly and took the Chernobyl nuclear plant territory. And this was actually as much a moral victory as it was strategic, seeing as how the nuclear disaster there is touted as the beginning of the Soviet downfall by many experts. Russia also began its heavy bombardment of missile strikes in populated areas around Ukraine. On the Ukrainian side, the first days were marked by fear and uncertainty, as well as a draft conducted by President Zelensky to build the Ukrainian forces and begin to resist the invaders. Anyone not involved in the resistance or aiding the resistance began deciding if they were going to flee the country, and many did. In fact, almost 1 million people evacuated the country in the first week. It was also at this time that many countries, including the US, began issuing their first round of sanctions on Putin personally, but also targeted Russian banks and trade markets in an attempt to weaken the Russian economy. In the days that followed and into the second week of the invasion, we began to see the resolve of the Ukrainian resistance. Russia continued to ramp up their missile strikes to soften the Ukrainian forces, but they weren't making much progress in gaining territory due to the fierce fighting on the ground. It was during this time that the two countries agreed to meet and discuss options for peace. All talks were fruitless, as Russia wouldn't even agree to allow refugees to leave the country safely, and the fighting continued. Now into week 3, we began to see foreign countries, again the US included, ramp up support for the Ukrainian resistance. Additional sanctions, including sanctions on oil, were put in place, and aid in the form of weapons was sent from some countries as well. The Ukrainians were putting up one heck of a fight, and the resistance outwardly appeared to be stronger than Putin had originally thought it would be. It was during this third week that we began to see a change in the tactics from the Russians. Additional aggression was sent towards civilian targets, such as the horrific bombing of a maternity hospital. And the refugees fleeing the country surpassed 2.5 million people, with an additional 2 million still in the country trying to get out. At this point, there was a lot of propaganda from both sides, claiming that they were in the right and they were winning, and they're condemning and slandering the other, to the point that it was hard to know who was even telling the truth about how the war was going. In the most recent weeks, so that's weeks 4 through current, we saw that our mainstream media has really described this as a Russian retreat. They pulled troops back and appeared to be reeling, and here's where I'm going to jump in and say a couple things. The Ukrainian resistance has fought valiantly. And I do believe that they have brought a much heavier fight than Putin thought they would. Couple that with the fact that Russia has made a couple of key tactical mistakes, and mostly due to underestimating their opponent. And we can see why some people believe that Russia may not be guaranteed the victory. But here's the deal. Russia attacked Ukraine with an army size of about 150,000 to 200,000 personnel, according to multiple different reports. That's nothing. Russia has an active military population of almost 1 million members, and an additional 250,000 in reserve, not to mention there are over 46 million people of military age that are described as military fit for service. 46 million. The entire population of Ukraine is 43 million. So why didn't Russia send a much larger force to completely destroy Ukraine right away? It's simple. That's not how the Russian military operates. There are many sources that detail Russian military maneuvers, like The Russian Way of War by Richard W. Harrison, or The Russian Military Power and Policy by Stephen E. Miller. And literature like these outline that when Russia has been involved in war, they operate differently. Russia loves to send small detachments to target areas first, and we've seen this in Ukraine. Russian troops launch rockets to soften up resistance, and then send ground troops in to more or less assess the situation. And if they're able to take control of the area, great. If not, they pull back and report to their leaders on what kind of resistance is in the area and prepare for the final assault. And this is the stage we're in now. Russians have waged war all over Ukraine, and Ukraine has largely been able to resist them by giving everything they had to the defense of their country. However, they also have shown all of their cards at this point. Russia got exactly what they needed. They now know what they're up against, and they will prepare appropriately as they continue this invasion even stronger than before. And this is actually why President Zelensky has been so desperately asking for help, even when it looked like he was handling Russia just fine on his own. He knows what's coming. And short of World War III or a miracle act of God, Ukraine will fall to Russia. Now, how that will look could come about in a couple of different ways. The first being surrender by Ukraine. Although this doesn't seem likely based on things we've already seen, I don't see Ukraine fully surrendering anytime soon, at least. Another option could be a mutual occupation agreement. So basically, Russia would control Ukraine, but Ukraine would get to keep some areas for the time being under their control, or get to keep some form of government. But again, this doesn't seem likely. And the last option is just a full takeover of the country. And this seems most likely to me based on what I'm seeing. As we've mentioned, Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet Union, and he needs total control to do that. So this is the scenario that I see playing out. Unless, as I mentioned before, World War III breaks out, because this would throw a monkey wrench into everyone's plans. Or a true act of God takes place in Ukraine, and he allows them to figure out a miracle way to secure long-term defense against Russia. So why does this matter to us? Well, this is actually pretty obvious, because we're seeing some of the effects daily in our lives. War doesn't have a history of bringing success and strong economies to the world. And as technology advances and we continue to grow, and new trade agreements evolve, and the global economy gets bigger, the world in turn begins to shrink. And here's what I mean by this. Actions like this invasion of Ukraine send ripple effects through our global system, which is becoming more and more connected. And it's part of the reason we see increased inflation in our grocery stores and gas stations here at home. Now, Biden has been doing a really good job destroying our economy and driving inflation costs to record levels all by himself already. And Biden has loved every second of getting to publicly blame Putin for the inflation that he actually caused. To be sure, Putin hasn't helped things, but I want to make it clear that we had crippling inflation problems already starting thanks to Uncle Joe. The bigger picture of the problems of this war, I don't believe have been fully realized yet. Because Ukraine was a test, not just for Russia with bigger plans in mind, but also for the biggest thorn in our side, China. They have their own territorial ambitions and even more leverage against us than Russia has, since we buy everything from them. Ukraine was an experiment. They weren't a part of NATO. They were moderately sized so Russia could test their military strategies with pretty minimal danger of losing. But mostly, This was a chance for Russia and China to see what NATO and the world would do if they invade another country and try to take it over. And so far, they're on the winning side of this gamble. The West, US included, responded with sanctions, minor weapons aid, and a whole bunch of strong talking. Folks, sanctions don't work. They have been tried over and over and over again, even in the last 80 to 90 years. We tried economic sanctions against leaders like Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Castro, Kim Jong-un. We tried against terrorists and evil regimes in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Bosnia, Libya, Nicaragua, Serbia, the Sudan. Folks, they don't work. All they accomplish is pushing these countries away from peace with the US and NATO and into alliances with other hostile countries. And we're seeing this again. Putin responded to the sanctions by saying that you can't isolate a country as big as Russia. And a leading Russian diplomat responded by saying that, and I quote, Russia doesn't give a naughty word about sanctions. And he claimed that Russia already has so many sanctions on them that they're used to working around them. And there's probably some truth in that. The saddest part of this whole ordeal is that the damage is already done. Biden and other Western countries have been buying so much oil from Russia instead of drilling our own. And even though they stopped now, Putin already has the money and influence he needed to kickstart his plans. Our concern now is to minimize damage, especially when it comes to China. Because of how closely intertwined we are again, thanks to Biden, sanctions against China would cripple us completely. So having to respond to an invasion in Taiwan is a bad situation for the mental basket case Uncle Joe to be in. This podcast was tough to research. I'm not even going to lie to you. Because there are so many aspects that we as citizens have absolutely no say in. Outside of writing your representatives and urging them to stand up for America's interests, we need to be holding this country up in prayer as well as Christians. Putin has promised retaliation to countries that stand in his way. And you'd be a fool to think that he won't attack us here in America if the opportunity presented itself or if he feels threatened somehow. I mean, he put his nuclear forces on high alert 3 days after he invaded Ukraine. And folks, Vladimir Putin is clearly unbalanced, and he has an ego the size of his country. And it's a matter of time before Ukraine falls, and we will see what phase 2 of his plan is. Now, I don't want to end this episode on a total down note, though, because throughout this evil, terrible ordeal, we've actually seen positive trends in Ukraine with people coming to know Christ. Reports from a Christian group based in Kiev called the Ukrainian Bible Society have said that there have been significant increase in people coming to accept Christ and even just asking for Bibles. One such story came from a man who came to get food from the organization, and they gave him a Bible as well. And as he stood there holding the bread in one hand and the Bible in the other, he looked up and he said that he believed he needed the Bible more than the bread in his life, and he knew it was time to come to Christ. He was 70 years old. He had never read the Bible before, but still recognized his need for a Savior. And that is so cool. And it's not the only story out there. There's tons of them. So keep these groups and individuals in your prayers as they continue to preach the gospel in extremely hostile and dangerous situations, because God is still working. And no matter the evil in this world, He is in control. Never forget that. Okay, I'm going to wrap this one up. I understand there is so much involved in what's been going on, and if you have any questions or you just want to chat, please contact me at patriotbacktalk@gmail.com or contact me through the Facebook page. And remember, never back down or be ashamed of your patriotism. God bless you all and stay crazy. We'll talk soon.